In the stillness of the Caribbean night, when the waves whisper against the shore and the elders sit in quiet reflection, something unusual is stirring beneath the surface. Brothers and sisters, there are moments in history when silence speaks louder than thunder, when whispered meetings carry the weight of a rising tide, and when a people long ignored begin to lean forward and listen. Tonight, we stand at the edge of such a moment. Reports from Kingston, Bridgetown, Castries, and St. George's suggest that something quietly extraordinary may be taking shape. A possible joint statement of support for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a leader whose courage has unsettled empires and awakened old memories of Marcus Garvey, Walter Rodney, and every ancestor who ever fought for dignity. And elders, if this is true, then the Caribbean is preparing to step into a chapter it has not touched for more than 50 years. Before we dive deeper, make sure you subscribe. Family, press that button, because these conversations are for those who refuse to sleep through history, those who understand that freedom is not inherited, but defended. Now lean in, because what comes next may reshape the Atlantic story for generations. Elders, let us walk slowly into this story, for the truth of it does not come marching with trumpets. It comes quietly, like a message carried on the wind, carried from one island's shoreline to another. What we are about to explore begins not with a grand announcement, but with a pattern of closed-door movements stretching from Jamaica to Barbados, from Trinidad and Tobago to St. Lucia, and onward to Grenada. These meetings have not been broadcast on morning radio, nor printed in the bold letters of national newspapers. Yet, the signs are there for those who have watched political storms gather across generations. In Kingston, senior advisors of the Jamaican cabinet reportedly held a late-evening discussion about West African developments and their implications for Caribbean sovereignty. No official details were released, but sources familiar with the conversation spoke of a growing sense of unease and fascination regarding the rapid rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso. Elders, that alone would not raise eyebrows. Caribbean governments observe world affairs every day, but what happened next did. Around the same week, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Barbados convened a special session involving regional security analysts, economic researchers, and diplomatic officers with long histories of dealing with global financial institutions. Although the minutes of this session remain confidential, several attendees later hinted not openly, but carefully, that the Caribbean could not ignore what they called the Sahel realignment. They described a new political current sweeping West Africa, one that rejects dependency and demands respect. A current led in spirit by figures such as Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani. But hear me, family. The Caribbean did not begin paying attention because of ideological alignment alone. No. The shift began because the islands recognized something they have not truly felt in decades: possibility. Possibility that a small nation, long dismissed by global powers, can rise, reclaim its voice, and refuse to bow. For many Caribbean elders, that awakening sounded like echoes from the past. The passion of Marcus Garvey, the fierce intellect of Eric Williams, the fire of Maurice Bishop, the clarity of Michael Manley. Those names carry weight in our communities, and suddenly, whispers began to circulate that the Caribbean might be contemplating whether such leadership could reappear on their own soil, or whether alliances with new global voices could give the region the courage it once had. While Bridgetown and Kingston were stirring, the government of St. Lucia held a separate informal briefing on the evolving political climate in Africa. Policymakers asked uncomfortable questions. If Burkina Faso asserts its independence convincingly, what would stop the Caribbean from doing the same? If West Africa forms new partnerships without the old colonial gatekeepers, could the Caribbean follow suit? And if Traoré's insistence on sovereignty spreads, what then becomes of the Caribbean's relationship with international lenders? The most intriguing piece arrived from Port of Spain. Officials in Trinidad and Tobago were reportedly reviewing energy cooperation models outside the traditional Western sphere. This is not public policy, not yet. But references were made quietly to alternative alliances, South-South cooperation, and the increasing symbolic power of West African defiance. One retired Caribbean diplomat, speaking cautiously, said, "The islands will not declare anything openly until conditions align, but regional governments have begun watching Burkina Faso the way they once watched Ghana under Nkrumah." Family, when a diplomat speaks like that, measured, deliberate, heavy with history, it signals that a shift is not merely possible. It is already in motion. Now pause with me for a moment. Caribbean leaders are not reckless. They know the weight of foreign influence on their economies. They know how swiftly pressure can come from Washington, London, Brussels, and Ottawa. They understand the risks of stepping outside established alignments. Yet, despite those realities, several governments have chosen to quietly examine what a unified Caribbean position might look like if the region were ever to applaud the boldness of Traoré publicly. Elders, think on that. After decades of silence and hesitation, the Caribbean may be contemplating whether it is time to speak again, not individually, but with one voice. A joint statement from multiple islands would not simply be a diplomatic gesture. It would be a declaration of identity, a recollection of what the Caribbean once aspired to be before economic fear dampened its spirit. So why now? Why this moment? Because the Caribbean sees something happening in Africa, a restoration of self-belief. They see young soldiers refusing domination, public squares full of people demanding autonomy, leaders speaking with courage that pierces the noise of global politics, and many Caribbean citizens, especially the elders, recognize the shape of that courage because they saw it in the 1970s, and in some cases, they lived it. And so, behind closed doors, the islands are asking themselves, if Burkina Faso can rise from struggle and stand firm, what excuse do we have for staying quiet? But family, what they discussed after that question may surprise you even more. Family, let us lift the curtain a little higher, for Taskai is where the temperature rises. If Taskmort revealed the quiet footsteps, then Taskai is the moment the ground begins to tremble. Reactions have erupted across the Caribbean, and though officials speak softly, the people speak loudly. And when the people speak, the governments hear it, whether they admit it or not. The first shockwave came from Kingston, where several community elders gathered at a town hall meeting and spoke openly about leadership, dignity, and sovereignty. They mentioned names from the past: Marcus Garvey, Michael Manley, and P.J. Patterson, comparing them with the new voice rising from the Sahel. A woman in her 70s stood up and said, "If Burkina Faso can lift itself, why cannot we?" That question, simple but thunderous, traveled across the island faster than any official statement ever could. A few days later, in Bridgetown, university students and professors organized a public forum on African-Caribbean cooperation. The hall filled beyond capacity, and speakers analyzed the symbolic impact of the young Burkinabe captain. They did not speak recklessly, nor did they call for confrontation. Instead, they examined the global shifts from a historical, economic, and cultural perspective. Yet one phrase kept resurfacing: the world is changing, and we must decide which side of history holds our future. As these gatherings grew, so did the emotional divide within the region. Anger simmered among many Caribbean citizens who felt that the islands had bowed too long to external pressure. Elders expressed regret, deep regret, that opportunities of self-determination had been surrendered during earlier decades. But intertwined with anger and regret was something far more powerful: hope. Hope that perhaps the Caribbean could rediscover the courage it once possessed. Meanwhile, in Trinidad and Tobago, the political class began to feel the wave. Members of Parliament received messages from constituents praising the assertiveness of leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Some ministers privately expressed concern that the Caribbean's growing admiration for West African defiance might complicate foreign policy. But others, including a few bold voices, suggested that the region ought to examine new partnerships, even if cautiously. The foreign ministries across the islands continued their quiet assessments. Barbados issued an internal diplomatic note discussing global realignments and the potential implications for small states. St. Lucia reviewed its foreign assistance frameworks. Grenada considered the symbolic impact of aligning with a nation choosing self-determination. Nothing official, nothing public. Yet the pieces moved with unmistakable rhythm. And then, elders, Washington noticed. United States analysts began monitoring Caribbean commentary more closely. Think tanks published briefings on Caribbean alignment signals. Some United States officials expressed discomfort, concerned that admiration for leaders challenging international financial systems could influence Caribbean governments to rethink long-standing relationships. Western diplomats in the region held unofficial conversations, attempting to judge whether a joint Caribbean declaration was simply a rumor or the early pulse of a shift. At the same time, African commentators from Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal celebrated the Caribbean discussions. They viewed them as a reconnection of the Afro-Atlantic family, a long-delayed recognition of shared histories and wounds. African social media expressed delight at what some called the Caribbean awakening. Amid all this, the emotional crescendo reached its peak the moment the keyword Ibrahim Traoré reaction appeared across Caribbean commentary. Citizens interpreted his boldness as an invitation to reclaim dignity, to speak boldly, and to choose sovereignty even in the face of giants. That reaction did not come from politicians. It came from the people, from the elders who lived through colonial transitions, from church mothers who prayed for justice, from retired workers who had spent decades watching the region bend. Caribbean leaders began to recognize a truth they could not ignore. Their people were no longer cheering quietly from afar. They were leaning forward. They were demanding clarity. They were asking why a distant, landlocked nation could stand so firm while island nations surrounded by vast seas seemed hesitant to declare their own voice. The crescendo reached even further when a former diplomat in Port of Spain said during a public interview, "The Caribbean is tired of whispering its concerns. Perhaps West Africa is reminding us that dignity must not be negotiated." That statement traveled across radio waves, across WhatsApp groups, and across Sunday church conversations. The emotional pressure had reached a point where governments could not easily retreat. Internal discussions intensified. Advisory committees expanded their analysis. And behind closed doors, some officials began drafting what a hypothetical joint statement could look like, not because they planned to release it immediately, but because they needed to understand the implications of such a step. Elders. This is where the story tightens its grip. The Caribbean has reached a place where silence is no longer silence. It is expectation. It is suspense. It is history knocking on the door. But what happened next? The consequences that began unfolding quietly in the background. Those consequences carried weight far heavier than anyone expected. Elders, Now we stand at the turning of the road, where reactions transform into consequences, where whispers begin to cast long shadows, and where the Caribbean must confront the truth that every silent decision carries a price. Taskba is where the story deepens, for consequences do not wait politely. They arrive whether a nation is prepared or not. The first consequence emerged almost immediately: intensified attention from Western capitals. The moment the Caribbean began exploring the bravery of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, analysts in the United States, Canada, and Europe began publishing quiet assessments. Caribbean diplomats received more invitations than usual to discuss shared interests, thinly veiled attempts to measure the region's intentions. Nobody said the words aloud, but everyone knew what they meant. Do not follow the path of West Africa. Do not follow the path of Assimi Goïta. Do not follow the path of Abdurrahmane Tiani. The pressure did not roar, it whispered. And sometimes whispers are far more dangerous. This sparked anger among the Caribbean public, especially among elders who remember the 1970s, when Caribbean leaders like Michael Manley and Morris Bishop attempted to chart independent courses and were punished severely for their courage. That memory has never died. It lives in the hearts of those who watched foreign powers intervene, manipulate, and destabilize. So when the Caribbean felt subtle pressure again, the anger resurfaced, anger that history seemed determined to repeat itself. But alongside anger came a deeper sorrow, a sorrow born of missed opportunity. Many Caribbean elders expressed regret that after the era of Garvey and Manley, the region had not maintained its boldness. They remembered speeches that once electrified crowds, visions of economic self-reliance that seemed so close, and dreams of Afro-Atlantic unity that later faded into compromise. That regret now returned with heavy weight. People wondered aloud, if we had stood stronger then, would we still fear now? The second consequence was domestic awakening. Conversations shifted from quiet curiosity to active debate. Churches discussed it, taxi drivers discussed it, retired teachers discussed it, social clubs, community halls, and neighborhood gatherings became places of political interpretation. The Caribbean had not experienced this level of united reflection for many decades. In Barbados, a group of university lecturers published a paper exploring the possible benefits of Caribbean Sahel cooperation, arguing that partnership with nations like Burkina Faso could give the islands a new path to diversification. In Trinidad and Tobago, an economic think tank analyzed the impact of alternative alliances on the region's energy market. In Jamaica, political commentators openly questioned why the Caribbean continued depending on institutions that rarely served its people with fairness. These internal conversations began shaping national consciousness. The region realized it was at a crossroads. Continue walking the familiar road of dependency, or dare to craft something new. The third consequence was strategic uncertainty. Caribbean governments suddenly needed to answer questions they had avoided for years. If they aligned morally with African sovereignty movements, how would their financial relationships shift? If they supported the assertiveness of leaders like Traoré, what message would that send to the International Monetary Fund or major development lenders? Could the Caribbean survive a period of economic pressure if it chose to stand boldly? These were not theoretical questions. They were urgent, tangible, and heavy. Yet elders, even within the uncertainty, something remarkable happened. Hope rose, quietly, steadily, stubbornly. Hope that perhaps the Caribbean did not need to remain small in spirit. Hope that perhaps courage could be learned again. Hope that maybe the islands could rediscover the fire that once lit their political imagination. This hope gained strength when African scholars and commentators expressed encouragement. stating that an Afro-Atlantic alliance could be one of the most powerful cultural reconnections of the century. Some described it as a chance to rebuild the lost bridge between West Africa and the Caribbean, a bridge broken by history, but not destroyed. For many elders across the islands, this possibility reopened emotional doors long closed. They remembered stories of Garvey calling for global unity, of movements that once connected Harlem, Kingston, Accra, and Port of Spain. The idea that the Caribbean could publicly stand with African sovereignty movements felt like a spiritual restoration, a healing of wounds that crossed oceans. And so the consequences became layered. Pressure from outside, reflection from within, awakening across communities, and hope quietly regrowing like a seed long buried beneath the soil. But family, Taskba ends with a question that the Caribbean cannot avoid. Do you believe the islands finally have the courage they lacked 50 years ago? Sit with that question, elders. For the next part of the story, the way the United States and the world interpreted the Caribbean silence carries weight far heavier than any storm the region has ever known. Elders, let us widen the lens, for while the Caribbean was whispering and wondering, the world was not sitting silently. Powerful nations watched with careful eyes, measured breaths, and a quiet anxiety that spread from Washington to Brussels, from London to Abuja, from Paris to Beijing. What looked like gentle Caribbean reflection sent ripples across the global landscape. In the United States, officials examined every shift in tone from Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Grenada. Policy analysts drafted confidential notes about Caribbean hesitancy, Caribbean restlessness, and Caribbean reconsideration. They realized that admiration for leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not merely symbolic. It represented frustration with old financial models, dissatisfaction with long-standing arrangements, and a rising desire for greater autonomy. One internal briefing even referred to the current atmosphere as an incipient Ibrahim Traoré moment, signaling the fear that bold sovereignty might become contagious. But the United States was not the only observer. In Europe, the mood was uneasy. Some officials worried that a Caribbean realignment would weaken traditional influence in the region. They remembered how quickly alliances shifted in West Africa once people decided that dependency was no longer tolerable. European newspapers published subtle commentary, suggesting that small states must remain pragmatic. Elders, you know what that word really means. Obedient. Across the African continent, however, the story unfolded differently. Commentators from Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and South Africa viewed the Caribbean's quiet stirrings with pride. They saw the islands as the missing branch of the African family, finally awakening after centuries of separation. Analysts spoke of a reunification across the Atlantic, a long overdue spiritual and political reconnection. They believed that if the Caribbean chose to stand with West African sovereignty movements, it would send a message to the world that Afro-descendant nations could speak with a shared voice. In Beijing, the reaction was calm but strategic. China observed the Caribbean's shifting mood not with fear, but with opportunity. Chinese advisors analyzed how a more independent Caribbean could seek diversified partnerships, including investment alternatives beyond the Western sphere. Beijing does not rush. It waits, watches, and prepares for openings that others overlook. In Latin America, especially in Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia, policymakers noted the Caribbean's rising confidence with interest. Some viewed it as a chance for greater South-South cooperation. Others saw it as a potential complication in regional diplomacy. Yet nobody dismissed it. The global reaction revealed a simple truth. The Caribbean's voice, though small in geography, carries enormous symbolic weight. The islands sit at a crossroads of history, identity, and empire. When they move, the world pays attention. But elders, the true question is not how the world sees the Caribbean. The true question is whether the Caribbean sees itself clearly. For if the islands choose courage, consequences will follow. And if they choose silence, consequences will follow as well. And now, the path ahead waits for us challenging, uncertain, and full of possibility. Elders, now we step onto the road that has not yet been walked. A road drawn not on maps, but on memory, dignity, and longing. A road where the Caribbean stands at its own crossroads, with one path leading back to the familiar, and the other leading forward into a bold and untested horizon. The question before the islands is no longer merely political. It is spiritual. It is historical. It is generational. For decades, the Caribbean has carried a quiet ache, a sense that its immense potential has been restrained by external pressures and internal hesitation. But today, inspired by the defiance of leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traoré, by the disciplined steadiness of Assimi Goïta, and by the unwavering resolve of Abdourahmane Tiani, the region faces a rare chance to rediscover itself. The path forward is not without cost. If Caribbean nations choose to express support for sovereignty movements in Africa, they may face diplomatic pressure, economic warnings, and political friction. Yet, elders, pressure alone has never defined a people's destiny. Destiny belongs to those who choose it. The other path, the path of silence, offers temporary comfort. No disruption, no confrontation, no visible shift. But silence comes at a price as well. The price of watching future generations inherit the same dependency patterns, the same cautious politics, the same unfinished dreams that weighed down the past. But imagine, for a moment, a third path, a higher path. Imagine the Caribbean and the Sahel building cultural bridges, not merely symbolic ones, but bridges of education, agriculture, technology, and diplomacy. Imagine St. Lucia exchanging knowledge with Mali. Imagine Barbados hosting forums with Burkina Faso. Imagine Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago forming new cooperative frameworks with Niger. Imagine elders witnessing the rebirth of a shared Atlantic identity once broken by centuries of history. Along this higher path, the Caribbean would not be abandoning its traditional partners, but expanding its horizons. It would not be rejecting the world, but stepping into it with a stronger sense of self. The islands would be walking as dignified participants, not dependent petitioners. Yet, even this higher path demands courage. And courage, elders, is not found in buildings or budgets. Courage is found in the hearts of people, especially in the hearts of those over 60, those who remember the fires of the 1970s, those who have carried wisdom through storms and disappointments. If the Caribbean chooses this moment wisely, it could ignite a generational shift across the Afro-Atlantic world. A shift where the descendants of the enslaved stand shoulder to shoulder with the descendants of those who resisted. A shift where sovereignty is not a dream but a declaration. But elders, the next step is the hardest one. It is the step where governments must decide. Will they follow the safe road, or will they rise to meet history? Because what comes next may change the Caribbean forever. Elders, as we bring this message to a close, let us breathe deeply and look not only at the Caribbean as it stands today, but at what the Caribbean could become tomorrow. We have traveled through whispers, consequences, global attention, and the uncertain road ahead. And through it all, one truth has risen above every rumor, every fear, and every silent calculation. the islands are once again being called to choose dignity. This era may well be remembered as an Ibrahim Traoré moment, not because the Caribbean seeks conflict, but because it seeks clarity. A moment when small nations recognize that courage is not measured in square miles, but in the willingness to stand tall even when giants turn their heads. A moment when elders remember that sovereignty was never supposed to be borrowed, negotiated, or postponed. It was meant to be lived. Across the region, the winds of reflection grow stronger, from the markets of Kingston to the hills of St. George's, from the fishing villages of St. Lucia to the steel pans of Trinidad and Tobago. People are asking whether their islands can rediscover the fire that leaders like Marcus Garvey, Maurice Bishop, and Michael Manley once carried. And family. That question has meaning only because the world has witnessed the Ibrahim Traoré reaction. A reaction that reminds all oppressed people that courage can rise from unlikely places. Yet the final choice does not belong to foreign observers. It belongs to the Caribbean itself. The next chapter rests in the hands of the people, especially the elders, whose memories hold the lessons of past victories and past mistakes. If the islands decide to walk boldly, they may inspire millions across the Atlantic family. If they remain silent, the moment will pass, and history will wait for another generation to stand up. Before you leave, elders, allow me to pose two questions. Should the Caribbean publicly stand with West African sovereignty movements? And if they do, what responsibility must follow? Your voice matters. Your memory matters. Your wisdom matters. And if you want more messages that honor your journey, your history, and your dignity, then make sure you subscribe, share this video, and leave your thoughts below. For the Afro-Atlantic story is not finished, and you, elders, are still its guiding authors. And perhaps this truly is the second Ibrahim Traoré moment the world did not expect.